like them can also go to college. In addition, they have strong relationships with the American athletes, but it's a different kind of relationship. And then because the students are organized into these teams at the camp, they develop stronger peer relationships as well. And then finally, there's greater deliberate practice that we try to implement. So not just teaching skills like implementation intentions or mental contrasting, but then giving them opportunities to practice that. And that's where I think sports can be really great, is because by definition, you have to be able to overcome setbacks. You're going to lose some of the time and control your emotions, things like that. So once I had those strategies, I thought of how can I embed these into program activities. So at a basic level, the program consists of 3-week summer camps. The teaching is done by teams of college volunteers from both the U.S. and Vietnam. And there's 3 types of classes. The first type I usually call life skills classes when I'm talking with the participants, but it's really the place where I try to embed the adaptations of social psychological interventions. The second group of classes is we teach academic lessons in advance from the upcoming school year using sports examples. And then we have classes that emphasize just basic proficiency in sports because they often don't learn that normally. There's no organized sports culture in rural Vietnam. And so as I mentioned, there's a team-based organization. So each student's part of a color team of 12 to 15 students. They take the same classes and competitions in that same team the whole time. And then the psychological strategies are embedded within multiple components of the program. This is just a sample schedule. Students in a given team will take 6 classes in all 4 sports, 6 classes in all 4 academics, and then they take the same life skills curriculum for the whole 3 weeks. The program is timed so that it occurs in the summer before each middle school grade. So technically a student can do the program up to 4 times, but realistically most do it less, also because sometimes we randomly assign them not to do it. So in that case they wouldn't do the program that summer. So looking at it from the activities perspective, this is the theory of change. There's the 3 types of classes, the teaching by college students and the team-based organization. So far, I've just evaluated the program as a whole. I deliberately did that because I first wanted to see, does any kind of psychological approach work? And then subsequently, I'd like to be able to understand specific mechanisms that might be playing a role. So this is really the contribution of what I'm presenting so far, is just the effect of these set of psychological strategies. So these are the 3 studies I've done. The first was just a basic observational study looking at how program participation was associated with different educational outcomes. The second was using a technique called discrete time survival analysis, which is really helpful when you want to understand whether and when an event occurs, like dropout. And then the third was I conducted a randomized trial in 2 different provinces. And I used a technique called instrumental variables estimation, which is helpful when you have non-compliance with random assignment, as tends to occur in places like rural Vietnam. Because ultimately you want to know what's the effect, the causal effect of participation in the program, not just being assigned to the treatment. So using the theory of change, these are the DVs that I analyzed for this first study. Desired and expected educational attainment, their efficacy with respect to college, as well as middle school, and the dropout rate and GPA. So I just had basic research questions. How is this affecting their desired life outcomes, their beliefs about education, their performance and persistence in middle school? I had 135 students. I gave them a survey in February 2010. This was after we had had 2 of the programs, so in 2008 and 2009. So students had either done none, 1, or both programs. And then they were either in the 7th, 8th, or 9th grades. So the first result is that greater participation was associated with higher educational aspirations. So especially for 2-type participants, they were more likely to want to have a master's or a doctorate degree relative to lower levels of education. There was also a trend for expected attainment, but it was not significant. Second, these are the raw means for the dropout rate. So you can see that for non-participants, 21% had dropped out by that time, relative to less than 5% for 2-time participants. So it seemed to be at least associated with a lower dropout rate. Third, I designed this scale to measure their perceived ability to reach college. And you can see here that participants were more likely to have higher levels on this outcome. I think this is interesting because Vietnam is a country of 90 million people, but only 2% have a university degree. So the fact that we can get some kind of relationship on this outcome, I think, is really important. There's a trend for increases in efficacy in middle school, but it wasn't significant. And then finally, there was program participants had higher GPAs in this 2009-10 school year, which was the school year directly after the second program. And what was really going on is it was less of a decline in grades. So I think similar to a lot of US students, there was a decline in grades over middle school, but two-time participants had the least decline in grades, which was equivalent to 0.28 standard deviations above the non-participants. So in summary, in this first study, participation was associated with higher educational aspirations, lower dropout rate, better performance in school, as well as better efficacy to reach college and to do well in middle school. There's also this idea that greater levels of participation were associated with greater effects, which is something that we'll see in other studies that I've done as well. So just returning to the theory of change, I've highlighted in yellow the outcomes that this study provided evidence for. So I think my goal over the next several years is to try to build out the model of this theory of change and then adjust it where necessary. So for the second study, I was focused explicitly on the dropout rate. How is program participation associated with the dropout rate or not? I did this at one of the schools where we've had the program for 5 years. So we had a lot of longitudinal data there. And first, I just wanted to establish what is the baseline risk of dropout there, and then when are students most at risk? So that's what my first question was. Second, I wanted to know, does program participation affect the risk of dropout in a given semester, and also does it increase the probability of completing middle school? And then, in turn, does participation in multiple camps have a greater effect? And then finally, does the program close the gap between, the retention gap between low and high GPA students? So I started with 351 students. They represented 2 cohorts, one that entered in the fall of 08, one in the fall of 09, and then I also controlled for their baseline GPA in the fall of 6th grade. So I used that to determine who were low and high GPA students at baseline. So for the first question, this is a hazard probability plot, and it's just showing, given that a student has not dropped out previously, what is the probability that they will drop out in the current semester? And so you can see the highest risk of dropout is in the fall of 8th grade, and then there's also some high risk in 7th grade fall and 9th grade spring.
But does that mean that they don't show up for fall of 8th grade, or that they drop out within that term?
They drop out in that term, and then they don't come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if they dropped out in the summer between 7th spring and 8th fall,
It would be
that'd be
reflected in the
attributed
fall.
7th spring.
Yeah.
That'd be attributed to the 8th fall?
Yeah.
Okay, so it could be a kind of summer.
Yeah. But
So the peaks are all falls.
yeah.
You haven't dropped in the summer.
Yeah, because the camp itself occurs in the summer, so I didn't want it to be conflated with that. I was trying to, but yeah, that's one of the issues. In general, if they're dropping out in the fall, they're dropping out because they don't show up. It's not they're dropping out once they're there. And then you can use that graph to produce a survival probability plot. And so all this is that it accumulates the risks of dropping out. So everyone starts with 100%, and then by the spring of 9th grade, only 57% remain in middle school. So it shows that in this community, dropout is a real issue. This is a kind of a complicated model, but the basic point is that if you control for 6th grade GPA, the odds of dropout are 79% lower with a single CFC camp in the summer. And so that's the odds of dropout in the next 2 semesters. I tested a long-term effect as well. So what actually seems to happen is that it lowers the risk just in those 2 immediate semesters. And so if you want to get longer-term effects, you have to participate multiple times in the program. So this is providing kind of the envelopes of the effect. So for low GPA students, the top line represents at baseline, if a low GPA student had no participation, this is what their risk of dropout would look like. If they were able to participate in all 4 camps, though, their risk of dropout would remain low throughout middle school.
Is your intuition that it's repeated participation and exposure to the program per se, Or is it participation with older and older peer groups that are maybe bonding around not dropping out of school?
That could be, yeah, I'm not sure. I do think that participating early is really beneficial, like 6th and 7th grade, because sometimes if a student participates 1st and 8th or 9th, at some level it's harder to reach them. The 6th and 7th grade are more obedient, they're more willing to absorb the lessons. I will also talk about later, when people participate for the first time, they have a lot greater effects as well. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure, but I'd love to be able to test like what is the reason for that. But I guess that's similar to the interactional continuity idea from BEM, Caspian, Elder, where you're selecting yourself into peer groups that support your choices. So this is the same graph, but in the survival format. So you can see that a low GPA student with no participation only has a 26% chance of reaching the end of middle school. But if they do all 4 camps, it's a 73% chance. So that's a really big difference. But given that it's hard just logistically to count on students doing all 4 camps, I wanted to know what's the effect of lesser participation. So here I'm looking at the effect of 3 camps. This is the purple line here. And you can see that basically if a low GPA student participates in 3 camps, their risk of dropout is similar to that of a high GPA student who does not do the program.
Parker, can you say something like I know you're going to get to an experiment in a little bit, but can you say something about any possibility of selection effects? So who's participating, who's not participating? Are the kids, regardless of their GPA, who are more motivated in school or more supportive parents, the ones who participate? Is there a reason to think that, how should we be thinking about those questions?
Yeah, I would say probably they're more motivated. Well, so one factor is how close they live to the school, because the camps are held at local middle schools. So if they live really close by, then it's easy for them to come. That's one. 2 is probably that they are more motivated. But I think one thing that's interesting is there are so many reasons why a student might do the camp. There's some kids who only like to play sports, and so that's why they join. But then when they're there, they learn other valuable lessons. So that's going to be different from someone who's attending to gain academic knowledge. But like looking at my dissertation data, it did seem that the returning participants were more motivated.
The entering participants too? Like the difference between participants who entered for the first time versus those who never did? Looks like they were similar on GPA at least.
Yeah. But that's something and also it can be hard sometimes because there's ceiling effects on the scales that I use, so I can't understand their true level of motivation all the time. But yeah, I do think that's a risk, so that was one reason that motivated me to do a randomized trial of the program. So the blue line represents if a low GPA student does no camps, and then the red line is if they do just 1 camp before the 8th grade. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because if you remember that first graph, the risk of dropout was highest in the fall of 8th grade. So you can see that if they do that camp, their risk of dropout is much lower in the 2 8th grade semesters. Similarly, if they do both the 7th and 8th grade camps, they maintain a low risk of dropout for those 2 grades. And then with the purple line, if they do 3 camps, they have a low risk of dropout for 3 years.
Hi, I'm sure this is going to be like a minority question. Bear with me. If we take a step back, like this is so I'm used to seeing graphs like this in association with interventions like these, but they're typically in like America and in Western culture, such that dropping out could mean something to us, but not necessarily the same thing to them.